Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection was built upon three principal pillars. These were variation of form within species, competition in an inevitable struggle for existence, in which certain forms would prevail over others, and the gradual change of form over time, eventually producing new species. All three are embodied in the title of his 500-page abstract on the origin of species by means of natural selection or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. To Darwin, these three principles together comprised a law-driven process for evolution. Okay, let's ask a basic question. Was Darwin's reasoning correct? Let's look first at variation of form. Two questions come to mind. Where does variation in form come from, and what follows from it? Variation involves traits like, say, ear length of the fennec fox, Vulpes zerda, which inhabits the hot deserts of northern Africa. The fennec has unusually long ears. We'll get into why momentarily. For now, let's just assume that among all the fennecs in a generation, some will have shorter ears compared to normal, and some will have longer ears. There will be variation of form, in short. These pictures are an exaggeration, of course, just to underscore the point. Thank heavens for Photoshop. Where does this variation come from? Well, one possibility is that it is hereditary. They get it from their parents. Parents with normal length ears will produce offspring that also have normal length ears. The same goes for fennec parrots with long ears. They will produce long-eared children. And fennecs with short ears will produce short-eared offspring. This is heritable variation of form. Variation exists because it's inherited from variation in previous generations. That doesn't really tell us much because we've dodged the question, where did variation of form within previous generations come from? But it does underscore an important point about heritable variation. It's conservative. That is to say, it's the antithesis of change. Evolution, by definition, is change. Heritable variation will therefore not get you evolution. Darwin's idea, of course, was that evolutionary change comes about through selection of favored traits. Here's how that can work. The ears of mammals like our fennec can serve as heat dissipation surfaces. The fennec lives in hot desert conditions, and this is one reason why it has very large ears. It needs to dissipate a lot of heat, and the larger the ear surface, the better it can do this. But heat dissipation through the ears has to match the conditions for it. In cold conditions, heat dissipation needs to be lower than in a hot desert. Shorter ears can serve this purpose. Indeed, long ears may dissipate too much heat from the body when it's cold outside. In hotter conditions than normal, more heat needs to be dissipated. Fennecs may need to have even longer ears to do that job. Imagine now that the fennec's desert habitat becomes cooler. What will happen to the next generations? According to Darwin's theory, short-eared varieties of fennecs should prevail in the struggle for existence when conditions are cooler. The longer-eared fennecs would lose too much heat for the cooler conditions and would do poorly. The next generation would therefore consist of more short-eared fennecs than the previous generation. Keep doing this over many generations, and the evolution of a new species of short-eared fennecs should be the result. Nice and tidy. There's a wrinkle in this neat story, however. The wrinkle is adaptation. The literal meaning of adaptation is tendency to aptitude. Adaptability is one of the fundamental traits of life. Let's illustrate the problem, again with fennec ears. The length of a fennec's ears is partly inherited from the parents, but ears also grow and can change length. If, say, the fennec grows up in cold conditions, its ears can grow shorter. In other words, the ear length of fennecs can adapt, tend towards aptitude for colder conditions. This ability to adjust to prevailing circumstances is adaptation. The variation of form that results is known as adaptive variation. Okay, here's a question. What happens when these adapted phoenix reproduce? Will the next generation inherit the long ears of their parents? That is, will ear length be strictly heritable? Or will the ears of the next generation reflect the adaptation of the parents and start off with overall shorter ears? In other words, will adaptation be inherited? Here's the dilemma for Darwin's idea. His notion of selection of favored races demands that traits are passed faithfully across generations. Adaptive inheritance, in contrast, subverts this. Adaptive variation is the essence of the Lamarckian idea. Darwin deliberately wanted to distance himself from Lamarck, however. That was the only way he could see that his idea could be original and stand out from Lamarck's. We'll return to how Darwin dealt with this dilemma in a later episode. Here's a preview. He couldn't without becoming a Lamarckian himself. Okay, that was a little difficult and pretty subtle, truth be told. I had to introduce it, though, because adaptation turns out to be the problematic issue for the whole Darwinian idea. We'll be returning to that issue again and again, so tuck it into the back of your mind. In the meantime, let's turn now to that whole struggle for existence thing. That's a little more straightforward. Darwin's idea for the struggle for existence was inspired by Darwin's reading of Thomas Malthus's essay of the principle of population. Remember, Malthus asserted that geometric population growth of humans will always outstrip growth in the means to support them. A struggle for existence would inevitably follow. Humans were doomed to live perpetually in scarcity. Darwin thought there had to be a similar dynamic at work in nature. He thought the resulting struggle for existence would be the selector in natural selection. That had to be it. After all, Malthus had mathematics on his side. The trouble here is that Malthus's idea didn't really hold water. It didn't hold water at the time, and it doesn't hold water now. Why? There is an argument to be made for the geometric increase of populations. Not much of an argument, but it's true that the more people that are reproducing, the higher will be the rate of population growth. So at least there's a semblance of truth for Malthus's argument that population growth can be exponential. Will be is another question, but we'll defer that for now. Nowhere in Malthus's book, however, will you find any proof of his claim that sustenance could only increase arithmetically. He basically just asserted it. Actual statistics for, say, agricultural productivity show just the opposite, not only for modern times, but in Malthus's time as well. There's a puzzle here. Why did Malthus make what seems to be such a flimsy claim? It was flimsy even to the economists of his day. Why then did he make it? We need to put his 1798 essay into some perspective. Malthus was reacting against the backdrop of the failed revolution in France. Central to that failure was what Malthus regarded as excessive claims for the perfectibility of man, notably from that philosopher of the French Revolution, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The Reign of Terror, the regicide, the radical transformation of French society, all had put the French Revolution and all the ideology that went into it into quite a bad odor among the English. Malthus sought to damp down similar currents in England, and his 1798 essay was part of that. He wanted to show that human affairs and human beings operated under limits. Malthus's essay had another context, though. Malthus and other economists of his day were trying to make sense of a new phenomenon that had come out of the Scottish Enlightenment: free markets. Previously, markets had been under tight constraints, regulated either by royal charter or aristocratic landhold rights. Those restraints were weakened during the Industrial Revolution. Emerging free markets is what took their place. The question was, what were the rules that governed free markets? Malthus's 1798 essay was part of the debate over that question, which included that more famous avatar of the free market, the Scotsman naturally, Adam Smith. Let's sort through the basic problem because it has relevance to how we think about evolution. We start with a marketplace where producers can offer goods made from raw materials. Consumers can acquire those goods. Consumers then provide returns to the producers in turn. Returns can be either money or other items of value for trade. In Malthus's argument, the raw materials upon which all this depended were finite and limiting. If population grew, more consumers would demand more goods. As raw materials were drained to provide these goods, producers could only offer them at ever-increasing prices. This damped production, which would inevitably lead to a struggle among consumers competing for the diminishing supplies of goods. This was Malthus's reasoning. This was how he argued that there had to be constraints on how sustenance could be increased. His assertion of an arithmetic increase was really just an example. It's questionable whether he meant it to be taken as law. In the broader debate over free markets, though, Malthus was actually arguing from a fairly narrow conception of the marketplace. The participants in markets, the consumers and the producers, were not simply reactionary elements responding to the provisions of goods and services. Rather, they brought sometimes unpredictable elements to markets. Let's illustrate this by redrawing our model of consumers, producers, and markets. Consumers do not merely respond to the provision of goods, they desire goods. Markets are where those desires are satisfied. By the same token, producers also desire the returns that are provided when they sell products to consumers. Desires are not really predictable. They can sometimes exist entirely independently of the provision or availability of goods and services. To meet those unpredictable desires, producers must innovate. That is, they must decide to find new ways to meet consumers' demands. They work out ways to produce goods more efficiently with different materials or with different processes. By the same token, consumers can be innovators themselves. They can desire new products, or they can offer producers novel ways to be compensated for their work. In this way, consumers can become producers and producers can become consumers, blurring the distinction between them. And in turn, these desires and innovations can reshape markets in some pretty profound ways. In short, contrary to Malthus's constrained economies, free marketplaces are pretty dynamic places, shaped by desire and innovation, which essentially is limitless. In real-world terms, this is why food production has actually grown faster than human population. If anything, we now actually have a glut of food rather than a famine. Darwin really only saw the first part of this argument, Malthus's constrained vision of economies. Once he found an operating principle for natural selection, Darwin stopped there. Was this a fair thing for him to do? One might argue that talk of desires and innovation and marketplaces was all well and good when applied to human beings. We know human beings have feelings, desires, creativity, and so forth. But surely this reasoning could not apply to animals, plants, bacteria, protists. Surely these creatures cannot have desires and creativity and marketplaces. I think that's incorrect, and we'll be returning to this again and again, because this very question is at the heart of the fundamental critique of the Darwinian idea. When it came to adaptation and heredity, Darwin had no choice but to fall back on an essentially Lamarckian view. Okay, how about Darwin's assertion that evolution had to proceed gradually? In fact, Darwin's insistence that it be gradual. In this, he was reacting against that other avatar of the French evolution, Georges Cuvier. Cuvier's idea, we remember, was that evolution proceeded in fits and starts. Long periods of stability and little change interspersed with abrupt changes, which Cuvier labeled catastrophes. This was in direct contradiction to Darwin's conviction that if natural selection was correct, changes had to be imperceptibly slow and gradual. The problem for Darwin was that the fossil record existing then seemed to contradict this claim. Darwin thought the contradiction could be explained away by a flawed and incomplete fossil record. Well, what about that? As our understanding of the past has grown and the fossil record has improved, Darwin's gradualism is looking more and more iffy. For example, abrupt changes in the biota, as occurred, say, between the boundary of the Cretaceous and Tertiary periods, do appear to be literal catastrophes. For example, the boundary between the Cretaceous and Tertiary periods 65 million years ago saw a mass extinction and biotic turnover. The dinosaur fauna that dominated the Cretaceous period went abruptly extinct, and the mammals began to rise. In the 1970s, evidence emerged that this mass extinction and biotic turnover followed the collision of a large asteroid with Earth. Talk about a catastrophe! As our understanding of the past grows, it's becoming ever clearer that the history of the Earth's biota is indeed punctuated with numerous instances where the goalposts have suddenly shifted. Asteroids collide with the Earth, continents move, ocean floors open up, magnetic fields disappear or reverse polarity, supernovas erupt in nearby stars. All of these and more have been associated with extinction events, major and minor, throughout Earth's history. And the fossil record accurately reflects this. Cuvier was right and Darwin was wrong. Okay, what about more normal periods when asteroids were not raining down on the Earth? Could these periods be marked by gradual evolution of the type envisioned by Darwin? Improvements in the fossil record allow us to test that assertion as well. Some of the best involve ocean floor sedimentary cores. These continuously accumulate the remains of planktonic organisms as they rain down from above. These can provide a continuous record of the planktonic biota over spans of millions of years. Here's one example. It's a plot of thorax width of a small planktonic organism, known collectively as the radiolaria, versus depth in a sediment core. This core corresponds to a period from roughly 5 million years ago to about 1.8 million years. These black bars in the timeline represent periods of reversals of the Earth's magnetic field. During the black bars, the Earth's north magnetic pole was positioned over the south pole, opposite to the situation today. You can see that the pattern of thorax width versus time is not slow and steady. There are periods of stasis, plotted here in green, interspersed with periods of rapid change, plotted in orange. Pattern and rate of evolution, as it's measured, is complicated, not quite catastrophic, but not really gradual either. It's important to note that this is a very complete record of radiolarian morphology with time. If anything, I'd say this complete record supports Cuvier's idea more than it represents Darwin's. Okay, these data are for just one record, but similar patterns show up frequently enough to have prompted an alternative view of evolution, a kind of Cuvierism without the catastrophism. This is known as the theory of punctuated equilibrium, proposed by two prominent paleontologists, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould. Here's how punctuated equilibrium is usually portrayed. Here's a hypothetical course of evolution, plotted as time versus some change of morphology, like the thorax width of our radiolaria. This cartoon shows long periods of no change of morphology, plotted here as white vertical arrows, interspersed with abrupt shifts of morphology, plotted here with horizontal red arrows. Compare this with a gradualist picture of evolution, clearly much different. At the same time, we need to keep in mind that this is a cartoon depiction of punctuated equilibrium. Unfortunately, it's the cartoon version that most people see, and this itself has engendered controversy. We'll have to defer that topic as well. So that's Darwin's idea. We're left with a little bit of a conundrum, though. The Darwinian idea is now regarded as the dominant, indeed the only rational mode of thinking about evolution. I would even say it's regarded by some as the only permissible way to think about evolution. How did it get there? Darwin himself based his argument on three pillars. The first was an assumption about the heritability of form. For natural selection to work, well-adapted forms in one generation had somehow to be reflected in the offspring of the next generation. Darwin's own thinking about this problem actually forced him to adopt an essentially Lamarckian view of adaptive inheritance of adaptations acquired during an organism's lifetime. And this was exactly what he was trying to avoid. Then there's the struggle for existence, which switched on a light in Darwin's head. He had, so he thought, the rational mechanism for the natural selector. However, his inspiration was based upon a superficial understanding of economics and markets, one which was iffy in its day and remains iffy in our own. Finally, there's the argument that evolutionary change must be gradual and slow. He had no evidence to support this claim, and in fact there was ample evidence then to the contrary. He thought that could only come about through an incomplete fossil record. He was confident that the gradual change he simply knew had to be there would emerge as the fossil record got better and better. As the fossil record has become better and better, though, patterns and rates of evolution look to be diverse and often anything but gradual. It is Cuvier that is looking better and better, Darwin less and less so. So we come back to the basic question: how could a theory based almost entirely on erroneous thinking come to dominate our scientific and cultural conversations about evolution?